Good morning, everyone. And thank you to everyone for joining us for today's program, The Taboo Against Next Year in Jerusalem in the American Haggadah with Professor Jonathan D. Sarna. Please note that this program is being recorded. Also, everyone is muted, but we welcome comments and questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to address them at the end of the presentation. My name is Noah Gradovsky. I'm a board member of UTJ. Before we begin, a few remarks and notes. Thank you to our sponsors for the webinar, which are myself, in honor of Professor Sarna, and UTJ's new executive administrator, Rabbi Andrew Schultz, and Mitch Morrison, in recognition of Professor Sarna's decades-long remarkable scholarship and representing the finest of greater Boston academia, said from a fellow Bostonian. I'd like to also thank everyone who made a donation and anyone who made a donation as they registered for this program. It is greatly appreciated. For those of you who are new to UTJ, let me add a few words introducing our organization. The Union for Traditional Judaism, UTJ, is a group of rabbis, scholars, and lay people who advocate for a passionate, open-minded approach to Torah study and observance of Jewish law, halakha, rooted in classical religious sources and informed by modern scholarship. Our philosophy is distinguished by the symbiotic relationship between faith in God, in the God-given Torah, and intellectual integrity, and our emphasis on the sacred framework of halakha as our unifying guide. With that, let me introduce our speaker. Professor Jonathan D. Sarna is University Professor and Joseph H. Bell and R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University. He also chairs the Academic Advisory and Editorial Board of the Jacob Rader Marcus Center of the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati and serves as Chief Historian of the Weizmann National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. Author or editor of some 40 books on American Jewish history and life, his American Judaism, A History, Yale 2004, recently published in a second edition, won 6 awards, including the 2004 Everett Jewish Book of the Year Award for the Jewish Book from the Jewish Book Council. His most recent books include, with Benjamin Chappell, the award-winning Lincoln and the Jews, A History, St. Martin's 2015, and When General Grant Expelled the Jews, Shotgun Netbook 2012. His annotated edition of Cora Wilburn's previously unknown 1860 novel, Cosella Wayne, University of Alabama Press, and his co-edited Yearning to Breathe Free, Jews in the Gilded Age, America, Princeton, has also just appeared. Dr. Sarna is married to Professor Ruth Langer, and they have 2 married children, one of whom recently became the spiritual leader of my local Shabbat Minyan, and 3 amazing grandchildren. Finally, as part of introduction, as a point of personal privilege, my wife is an American Jewish historian and has benefited so greatly from counting Professor Sarna as a mentor, colleague, and friend over the many years, and I know how much her career has been enhanced through that scholarship and friendship. And now, with thanks to Professor Sarna for joining us today, I'll turn over the presentation to Professor Sarna.
Well, thank you very much, and really, and thank you, Noah, for inviting me, and warm regards to Melissa, and I thank all of you for joining us, and thanks to the UTJ for sponsoring. Why don't we show? I have a lot of slides, so if you can, there we go, screen share, that'll be good. Let's go to the next slide, which has content. I'm going to, next slide, please. I'm going to give you at the beginning, in case you need to leave, I'm going to kind of give you a summary of the kinds of questions that I hope to answer in this presentation. it's really, I think, unique in the history, literature of American Jewish life. I'm trying to tell a very big story on the basis of three Hebrew words that are very prominent in the Haggadah, L'Shana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. And as you'll see, my contention is that the appearance and disappearance, translation, illustration, and interpretation of these three words really reveal a lot about American Jews and the land of Israel, and about the place of Jerusalem, a real and imagined, in American Jewish life. And I have to say, I'm going to try and bring this all the way to the present. And as you'll see, it even illuminates our own difficult moment, pointing out that it has roots in a long past that has really come back in certain ways to the fore. Now, I will also say, for those who want the long version, and then we'll move forward, that I have an article in the wonderful Festschrift for Professor J.J. Schachter. They in the J.J. Schachter Festschrift that has some of this, and the next issue of Studies in Contemporary Jewry similarly will take the story from World War II to the present. If anybody really wants the long version, just shoot me an email, sarna@brandeis.edu, and I can send you one article and the proofs of the I want to start with the history of the phrase L'Shana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim. We translate it as next year in Jerusalem, but as we will see, that's a very recent appearance in the Haggadah. It was translated in other ways, but first let's ask, how did it get into the Haggadah? Let's go to the next slide, please. I'm just going to show you a few Haggadot. Next slide, please. That there you see, this is an interesting medieval Haggadah with a bird's head. With this is clearly Yerushalayim Shel Mala, and then you'll see two other Haggadot, Golden and David Stern's edition of the Washington Haggadah, both of which have L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim. Next two slides, no. The question is, how did it get into the Haggadah? After all, this is not found in the Mishnah, nor is it found in any of the early Haggadot. It's not in Sadia, it's not in Maimonides. Modern scholarship, principally Shlomit Elitzur, argue that L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim was a spontaneous phrase, like Hallelujah, or Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo, or Amen Ken Yehi Ratzon. It was a spontaneous phrase called out by Jews before the age of printing as a means of participating in prayer. Anybody who's ever watched Black churches knows that tradition of spontaneous expression. And that's what she argues. Oh, L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim. Next year we'll do it in the right place, in the temple in Jerusalem. And that was a folk practice, but over time, especially with the advent of printing, and we know this from the study of religion generally, folk practices harden into established communal norms, and we begin to see the phrase in manuscript Haggadot, and we've just seen them beginning in the 14th century. And in the published version, I give some of the sources that talk about it, but I want to jump now to America. Next slide, please. In America, the phrase is found already in the very first Haggadah printed in the United States. It's known as the Jackson Haggadah because it was printed by a man named Solomon Henry Jackson, Shlomo ben Tzvi Hirsch. And take a look at that translation right under on the right side, L'Shana Haba, thank you. The year that approaches, oh, bring us to Jerusalem. That, of course, puts the onus on God. And, oh, bring us is not identical with next year in. And in America, oh, bring us meant the Almighty would be responsible. That, of course, was acceptable to Jews' neighbors. God can do whatever God wants to do. And it also put the phrase in a rather acceptable messianic context. Nevertheless, it is clear that there were plenty of Jews in the 19th century in the United States, and not only in the United States. One could give a parallel lecture about other European countries, Germany, England. They worried maybe our neighbors will misinterpret L'Shana Haba'ah as a sign of disloyalty. We don't want to be here. We'd rather be somewhere else. We'd rather be in Jerusalem. And that explains a very famous line, often quoted out of context, by the Reform minister, he called himself minister, the rabbi of Beth Elohim in Charleston. His name was Gustavus Poznansky. And at the consecration of that synagogue in 1851, and you have to know, in 1851, March 19th, the consecration of that synagogue, which still stands, that was just 5 days prior to Passover. And he famously said, "This synagogue is our temple. This city," meaning Charleston, "is our Jerusalem. This happy land is our Palestine." And of course, a lot of the reform-minded Jews in Charleston didn't say next year in Jerusalem. Actually, the copy of the Haggadah in Isaac Leeser's prayer book, if you own one, they're quite rare and valuable. Isaac Leeser was the great traditionalist, Orthodox, if you like, UTJ avant la lettre, the minister at Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, and his Haggadah also omitted L'Shana Haba'ah Yerushalayim. It's not there. It doesn't have to be there for halachic reasons, and he omitted it. But that was not the common solution to the problem. The common solution, also found in Germany, is to include the Hebrew L'Shana Haba'ah Yerushalayim, sometimes in big Hebrew bold letters, but not to translate. Just leave it. The cognoscenti know what we're talking about, and nobody else needs to worry about it. Those discomforted or critical remained oblivious. Next slide. When we reach the first illustrated American Haggadah in 1857, some of you will recognize this illustration. It actually was first published back in 1695 in Amsterdam. It's Marion, and it was based on a copper plate, what they call intaglio print. It's an interesting illustration for next year in Jerusalem. It's totally imaginary, but the idea is this is the Temple of Solomon. See the sun rising, and ancient Jerusalem is thriving, flush with gates and courts and towers and domes and impressive structures stretching out as far as the eye can see. The magnificent Beit HaMikdash, the temple, is the visual center of the image. It's separated by a kind of surrounding ditch, and you can. This tells us a lot about how Dutch scholars primarily imagined that the Beit HaMikdash looked. No contemporary scholar imagines that that's what it was. We imagine it looked like ancient Near Eastern temples. But this is, and that's why I wanted you to see it, the most imitated Haggadah illustration of all time. It's copied and recopied in Haggadot throughout the Jewish world, and it's easy to understand why. It gave Jews a sense that, they had once been quite splendid and so on, but it was really a Christian art, and there are even editions of this, as Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi showed, where there are crosses, which here are largely removed. But this is how next year in Jerusalem was illustrated, and this Haggadah used the same translation that we saw earlier, the year that approaches, oh, bring us to Jerusalem, but it adds what Jerusalem looked like. Okay, let's move on to the next. We jump ahead 20 or so years, and a lot of Central European Jewish immigrants by then had lost interest in the traditional Haggadah. Surprisingly, the Pesach Seder, according to some data that we have, really fell into disuse, especially in Reform circles, and in hopes of stimulating a revival, a renewal of Passover. A scholarly rabbi, many on this will recognize his name because it was Marcus Jastrow, best known in Jewish life across the spectrum for Jastrow's dictionary many years later. But Jastrow, as many who use the dictionary will be sorry to hear or will be surprised, he also produced the first Reform Haggadah in America, family service for the eve of Passover. This is the 1883 edition, but the first edition was 1878. And if you look at his Haggadah, no reference to Zion in the whole Haggadah. He takes out not only L'Shana Haba'ah, he takes out Adir Hu, which of course is about the building of the temple. Because Adir Hu had a melody that everybody knew, you can't just get rid of a traditional melody. So we have here the first of what are really many. If someone wants to do a fun project, go through the Haggadahs and find the many interesting English, not translations, but renditions sung to the tune of Adir Hu, but without the sense B'nai Beitcha B'karov, rebuild the temple as soon as possible. He even, by the way, Jastrow took Jerusalem out of Birkat Hamazon. It gives you a sense of how concerned people were that Passover would get them into trouble. This Haggadah, I should say, Jastrow later became much more positive toward Zionism. Now, since I didn't find even one Haggadah that used in the 19th century that used the phrase next year in Jerusalem, I said, well, maybe they didn't know that phrase. It was somehow, I assumed it was old. Maybe it's much newer than we imagine. But that hypothesis is quite false. You can do what I did. I simply plugged next year in Jerusalem, the phrase next year in Jerusalem, into the Hathi Trust. The Hathi Trust is what used to be Google Books, the largest collection of online books, a database, millions of books. And there were all sorts of examples of next year in Jerusalem. But as I went through them, I saw many of those examples were English books deeply critical of Jews for saying next year in Jerusalem and questioning whether they were really loyal. For example, the very first anti-Semitic pamphlet in America, the man's name was Telemachus Thomas Timaeus. Maybe you too would be an anti-Semite if you were cursed with that long name. But anyway, he wrote a book called The Original Mr. Jacobs, a startling expose in 1888. And he writes, the first condition of adopting another country is to renounce one's own, the Jew as a country that he never renounces. It is Jerusalem, the holy and mysterious Jerusalem serves as a tie to all her children who every year say, next year in Jerusalem. And I have many other examples in the published version, but I won't put them here. That helps to explain what is really great anxiety about printing next year in Jerusalem. Bring us to Jerusalem, as I said, puts the onus on God. That's unobjectionable. But next year in Jerusalem, Jews feared might be misconstrued as a statement of disloyalty, as if Jews awaited the first opportunity to emigrate. Now, the person who really transvalues the phrase next year in Jerusalem is Theodor Herzl. It's at the very center of his attempt at a modern solution of the Jewish question. The English version of, it's clearer in the English than in the original German, of Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, linked the idea of a Jewish state to the, quote, kingly dream embodied in the old phrase, next year in Jerusalem. And he tells readers, Don't just say it, do it. If you will it, it is no dream. Prove that the dream may be converted into a living a reality. When he says, I'm sure many have wondered their whole life, what does it mean if you will it? What is the it? Well, the it is L'Shana Haba'ah Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. And if you will it, it's no dream. So he really, with a stroke of the pen, transforms next year in Jerusalem from a messianic dream that a lot of progressive liberal Jews found embarrassing into a modern manifesto that Zionists found exhilarating. And what we see is that instead of concealing L'Shana Haba'ah, Zionists begin to trumpet it, transvaluing it, the old phrase, into a catchphrase, a pithy statement of Zionism's goals. And we can see that really in the 20th century. Next slide, please. In 1904, Lily Goldsmith Cowan, she's a Zionist, a new translation, better graphics and the like, first by a woman, I think anywhere. And what she does, and maybe Noah, you can point this out, in order to have a wide appeal, it's the traditional Hebrew, note L'Shana Bab Yerushalayim in bold, but then she put in small English font and indented lines, you see it there on the right, what can be omitted without touching what she calls vital parts of the service. And you see the distinction between L'Shana Haba in Hebrew, which one is bold about, and literally the English, which one is may omit and is reticent about. But the translation itself is unambiguous. Unlike what we saw before, here it is, in the year to come in Jerusalem. Next year in Jerusalem is still taboo for quite a while, but this opens the door to the Zionist option. We don't need divine intervention. We hope next year it'll happen. And in case there was any misunderstanding, she, in the 11th edition, I'm sorry, the 9th edition, published in 1911. Next slide, please, Noah. In the 1911 edition, lo and behold, we see Hatikva on the final page. It touched the Jewish world the world over, touched the Jewish heart the world over. And this is important because this dwarfed in numbers and significance all previous Haggadot produced in America. Hundreds of thousands of copies were sold in America and elsewhere in the English-speaking world. But her solution, we'll put next year in Jerusalem in tiny letters in English, that didn't quite work for anti-Zionists who emerged at the same time the Zionist movement. But let's go to the next slide. What I wanted you to see here, this is the J. Leonard Levy Haggadah. Rabbi Levy was, Dr. Levy, as he was known, was the rabbi at Rodef Shalom in Pittsburgh, Reform rabbi. But he wouldn't hear of next year in Jerusalem. His Haggadah has dialogue in it, but look at this. Where do we find civil, political, and religious liberty united today? Here in America. And he goes on with a kind of paean to American democracy. The Union Haggadah, much better known. Next slide, please.
The Union Haggadah of the Reform movement, there we are, which you can see here, which was the major Reform Haggadah, doesn't have next year in Jerusalem at all. Calls rather for bonds of love and duty and so on. And the closing has no mention, may all the wrongs that still prevail be righted in the coming year, no mention of Jerusalem at all. Now, during this period, of course, reform is becoming a small minority as more and more East European Jews move to America. They are used to a traditional Seder, and in a brilliant marketing tool really designed to tell people that coffee was kosher for Passover. The Maxwell House Company creates a Haggadah, which it gives out for free. Let's go to the next slide, please. The Maxwell House Haggadah is usually dated to 1932. It is the most widely distributed Haggadah in history, more than 50 million copies of its different editions in print. But what I wanted you to see is that it does include L'Shana Haba'ah Yerushalayim, but it goes back, so as not to frighten anyone. I think it's not on the slide. The following year, grant us to be in Jerusalem. Also notice that it does not use the same painting of the temple that we saw before, the Miriam painting. Instead, it takes a 15th century painting entitled The Building of Solomon's Temple. And I've always thought that's interesting. It's a kind of subtle indication that in the 1930s, Jews were beginning to build in Jerusalem, and a painting of the building of Solomon's Temple, let's look at the real painting on the next slide, seemed appropriate. Yeah, that, as you can see, that's the building. And the fact that not only the Hebrew, but an English translation appeared was somewhat telling. Now, next year in Jerusalem, the phrase next year in Jerusalem, next slide, please, finally appears in an English language Haggadah, thanks to the Anglo-Jewish historian, many on this line will remember his name, Cecil Roth. He lifted the taboo. There may be one or two rare Haggadot before, but Roth, in all of his Haggadot, used next year in Jerusalem. This one is his popular 1934 Haggadah, new translation, large capital letters. Take a look at that. And tellingly, the accompanying illustration by a poster artist named Donya Nachshon, it doesn't deal with the ancient temple, which all of the previous illustrations did. Instead, we see joyful pioneers, chalutzim, standing proud amid an alluring, sun-drenched and verdant Jerusalem being replanted and rebuilt. In other words, thanks to Cecil Roth, we look at present-day Jerusalem, not ancient or future Jerusalem. Next slide, the Cecil Roth pattern and translation also appeared in the, there we go, in the famous Shik Haggadah, which you're looking at. I'll just mention it because otherwise we'll you can ask questions about Schick later. Now, that still hasn't brought it to America. Both Schick and Roth were still in Europe, but it does come to America in 1941-42. If you can do the next slide. And both of these Haggadot are by professors at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Both are influenced by wartime politics, if you read them. Both, this is very important, both for the first time include music for L'Shana Haba'ah Yerushalayim. And as I said, when something has music, it has staying power. And it's more central. And both translate L'Shana Haba'ah Yerushalayim with an eye towards Zion's rebirth. What you're looking at now is Mordechai Kaplan's rather controversial reconstructionist, so-called New Haggadah. It highlights L'Shana Haba'ah Yerushalayim, which it placed at the very end of the Haggadah, after all of the singing. But note it's rather long and cumbersome translation, not next year in Jerusalem, but rather may the coming year witness the rebuilding of Zion and the redemption of Israel. We want Zion, but doesn't say we're going there. It's not us next year in Jerusalem. It's let Zion happen. And I think in some ways that reflected the views of a lot of American Zionists. They wanted the rebuilding of Zion. Where are all these refugees going to go? But they weren't so sure that they themselves wanted to go there. And the music that you see was by Judith Eisenstein, Kaplan's daughter. And on the last page of this Haggadah, it's not on the slide, is both Hatikva and America. Kaplan believed Jews lived in two civilizations, and he liked Hatikva and America. That's going to become more and more common. The more traditional Haggadah that was produced at the Jewish Theological Seminary, next slide, please, is that really a translation by Maurice Samuel. Louis Finkelstein had a lot to do with this Haggadah. It's very traditional. Finkelstein was the president of the seminary. In a sense, he was Kaplan's boss. But what I wanted you to see is, first of all, on the left, L'Shana Haba'ah Yerushalayim with an exclamation mark. On the right, next year in Jerusalem. The taboo has been broken in a traditional Haggadah. And then it occupies 2 full pages with music that begins very slowly, as if to recall the long centuries of tragedy, and then it is much livelier. I still learned that tune, although increasingly it's not the tune that's used. And we have a big emphasis suddenly on next year in Jerusalem. The Haggadah distributed to United States soldiers by the JWB, the Jewish Welfare Board, also has next year in Jerusalem. And that's why we're going to skip the next slide. They sent me the wrong copy there. So let's skip over the next slide and really move to the creation of the State of Israel, which is a new moment in our history. 1948, and we see a spate of Zion-themed Haggadot. What you're seeing now, this is the Schulzinger Haggadah. He had lived in Israel forced had been a refugee, and the Haggadah is suffused with military images of the Israel army that has created the new state of Israel. And clearly Jews took pride in that. Next slide. In the Orthodox community, you have Menachem Kasher, a famous and very prolific Orthodox rabbi, and he argues we should have a 5th cup of wine now added to the Haggadah because redemption has started with the creation of the state of Israel. His Haggadah, which is an amazing Haggadah, but they're both English and Hebrew editions, is full of proofs of the Messiah being near, a redemption is near. It gives a sense of the excitement of 1948. It was also influential. If you look at the next slide, you see a conservative rabbi, Morris Silverman, and those who can see it see Kos Hamishi at the top, the 5th cup of wine. And he too puts in a 5th cup after next year in Jerusalem, in gratitude for the creation of the state of Israel, a modern miracle as impressive as any recorded in our Bible. So this is coming, these innovative ideas, they don't win, they don't take off, but both in conservative and Orthodox circles. The next Haggadah is one many will be familiar with because it was immensely popular in America. Do we have another slide here? The next slide. There we go. This is 1953, and it's Philip Birnbaum. Philip Birnbaum, many people use his prayer books, and many other volumes. He supported himself with his pen. One of the features of Birnbaum was he did not believe in using different type sizes for different kinds of prayers, although you can see that he's emphasizing L'Shana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim in his text. But what's really interesting is, and that's on the next slide, he adds the singing of the anthem from the summit of Mount Scopus, Me'al Pisgat Har Hatzofim. And the reason he does that is that Israel controlled Mount Scopus, but it didn't control from 1948 the holy shrines located in the section. Those were still in Jordan. And so you're on Mount Scopus, and you say, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, I won't move from here. Jerusalem, the Messiah will come. It's also interesting, as you can see in the Hebrew, he's got Yerushalayim, he's got Hatikva, but he does not add an American anthem. He doesn't think that's needed. And the fear that yearning for Zion and Jerusalem might call into question American Jewish patriotism seems largely to have dissipated, and this Haggadah has vast impact and is many times translated, many times reprinted. Sorry, that's going to bring us to the 6-Day War, and following the reunification of Jerusalem, that was June 67, so it's after Passover, but next year in Jerusalem takes on new meaning for Jews in the United States after 1967. And Haggadahs published in the war's aftermath reflect this new reality. They have words like miraculous, and as we'll see in a minute, some view really 1967 in messianic terms. What you're looking at now is one of the best known Haggadah to come out. It was by the Jewish historian and writer Chaim Raphael, a feast of history, beautifully illustrated. And he writes, the miracle we prayed for has in some sense happened. And what you see there is Israeli crowds gathered at the Western Wall following the reunification. And next year in Jerusalem, therefore, rang true. We've been shaped by it. We see it, and it went through many editions. The Reform movement likewise puts out a brand new next slide, please. Brand new Haggadah in the wake of 1967. Again, pride. This is the Baskin Haggadah, as it's known, because of the striking illustrations by Leonard Baskin. Actually, the Haggadah was prepared by Rabbi Herbert Bronstein. And what's important about it is it totally re-embraces Zion. Indeed, I think we have a slide of that. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that it has at the very bottom there, L'Shana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim, and ever the hope of our people. And one would never know that there had been a huge number of Jews who wouldn't say it for 70 years. And in fact, it's very central in the Haggadah. The Hebrew letters dance. There's a landscape of the old city. They even transliterate L'Shana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim, and 1 million copies of the Baskin Haggadah were sold. So you really see how things have changed. At the other end of the religious spectrum in America, next slide, you can see almost better than anywhere else how the Six-Day War has impacted. Here is an illustration pre-Six-Day War of L'Shana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim. It's produced by something called the Religious Art Production Haggadah, a rabbi named Moses Greenfield, and it's rather conventional a scene of the spies bringing grapes and so on. Now take a look, 1971, they throw out that image, and here we have an image of a dramatic image. It's the only two-spread image, the crowned King Messiah. And I don't know if you can show this, Noah, but if you look carefully, you'll see the Messiah has his head buried in a book. He's studying a sefer. One can sit and try and ask oneself, I wonder which book the Messiah is studying on his way to the temple in Jerusalem, led by a shofar-blowing Elijah on the way to the temple being rebuilt and awaiting the Mashiach's long anticipated appearance. If you go to the next slide, you'll see another example of messianism in the wake of 1967 in parts of the American Jewish community. the chauffeur of the Messiah. We really are expecting that the Messiah is around the corner. Now, beyond this messianic interpretation, these years in other parts of the American Jewish community see a lot of attention paid to freedom. You have support, next slide please, of Soviet Jewry. This is the Podwell Haggadah, and note how Lishana Ha'Ba'ab Yerushalayim, in a sense, is the conduit from the Kremlin to a dreamscape of Jerusalem, and more than he ever dreamed, it came true. But we also have all sorts of other movement Haggadot in these years. Some of you will remember them: gay Haggadot, women's rights Haggadot, Tibetan workers' rights, animal rights. Some of them for third Seder, some traditional. This is where we, thanks to printing technology, we see more and more cultural universalistic Haggadot. The most famous example is the one you're seeing now, is the Freedom Seder by Arthur Waskow, who wants to fuse Passover with the history and future of all mankind. Next year in Jerusalem has no place in this Haggadah. Waskow replaces it with liberation now, next year in a world of freedom. There. But there were others. Next slide, please. The Jewish Liberation Haggadah found thorough compatibility of the revolutionary struggle and radical Zionism. Now, as we move forward, what we find is a kind of return to universalism in non-Orthodox Haggadot. Either next year in Jerusalem is completely abandoned, or it's replaced with a parallel: next year in freedom, next year in freedom and peace, and next year may all. I think we may even have an example of that. Next year, may all humanity be free, and the festival of freedom in springtime come to all the people of earth. And then you have new Haggadot that retain the familiar Hebrew and supplement it with something new. What you're looking at is Dick Levy's What you're looking at is the 1999 revision by the Reconstructionist movement of Mordechai Kaplan's Haggadah, and note that they update his translation from what we saw earlier to "May the coming year bring freedom to the oppressed, peace to Zion and Jerusalem, redemption of Israel and all mankind." It does not say we should go to Jerusalem there. More and more, the Strasfelds, for example, append to next year in Jerusalem, next year in a city of peace for all its inhabitants. The Bronfman Haggadah adds a whole paragraph after next year in Jerusalem to express a commitment to peace in the Middle East. The longer, the closer we get to our time, the longer the explanations of L'Shana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim become, and that seems to embody both the maddening complexities of the Arab-Israeli conflict and also the religious and political divisions within American Jewish society. They anticipate some really of what we are seeing today. So this Simply Seder from Berman House has a whole paragraph with 5 different explanations of next year in Jerusalem. You know, you say it and it can mean any number of things. And finally, and then we get to the conclusion, take questions. Those of you who have Jonathan Safran's Furr's New American Haggadah, it was so big I couldn't get a slide. It's got 4 lengthy commentaries, 2 pages of small print devoted to just 3 words, L'Shana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim, some familiar, others mystical, Hasidic, metaphoric, political, homiletical, all there. Now, the contemporary complexity surrounding L'Shana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim really, and now you can exactly have the last slide, recalls the anxiety that the phrase provoked really early on, where some discarded, some left untranslated, some distorted the translation. And we've actually covered almost 2 centuries of the phrase's appearance, disappearance, translation, illustration, interpretation. That, of course, shows that it's deeply significant, not just in the Haggadah, but also in the religious, cultural, and political life of the American Jew. But in a sense, every generation of American Jews has found itself pondering anew, what is my Jerusalem? Where does it lie? How do I, if at all, commemorate it at the Passover Seder? So I hope that gives you a sense of the large project. Maybe there's still time for some questions. I'll be glad to try and answer them. And
Sure. Thank you, Professor Sarna, for a fascinating journey through the 200 years roughly. We have I'm combining a few different points of people where they were thematically very similar. And you hit on, on Doctors Jastrow and Levy in the late 1800s through the first part of the 1900s as, really underscoring their fidelity to America. When do you start seeing that ebbing, or at least a greater confidence emerging, where they're loyal Americans, but they're also comfortable now as Jews who can also be thinking about Israel as a homeland?
Well, in the Reform tradition, that really happens in 1967, and that's why the Bronstein is so important. The Baskin Haggadah that Herb Bronstein did, that was a real revolution. And what's so interesting about the revolution there is they almost wanted to say, we've always believed in next year in Jerusalem, even though it hadn't appeared in the Haggadah. I think there were Reform Jews who felt that, well, we believe it, but we can't say it. We can't tell our neighbors, it's secret. And I could prove that. But there were others who were deeply opposed. And I thought it was a danger to the American Jewish community. The members say the American Council for Judaism. So 67, which is also a moment when the anti-Zionist American Council for Judaism really goes into great decline, that's a crucial moment. In the non-Orthodox world, I think the very fact that you had in World War II a Jewish welfare board, Haggadah, funded by the United States government and distributed widely, that not only had Next Year in Jerusalem, but some of them had Hatikva. That's deeply significant. The Stuart Halpern has a new Haggadah just out, in which has essays, and my essay is actually on that Haggadah. It's the Disolapul Haggadah, and with much greater length, but that's telling. And of course, it was a statement that the American government had no problem with Next Year in Jerusalem. And that made perfect sense, because they didn't want all those DPs coming to the United States. Where else are they going to go? Let them go to Palestine. Let them go to the land of Israel. Yeah, other questions?
And in fact, your last point about with the American refugees and American policy is a beautiful segue. Sarah Brooks asked a question. I'm just going to contextualize it a little bit. She asked about, and Sarah, I see you're still on, so you can always unmute as well. You asked about what about the refugees, and I would just maybe amplify that slightly to look at the two major immigration movements, the second one happening in the 1910s, and then also after the Shoah. What role do those play in the, in the hashkafa of the Haggadot, both within Orthodox and also maybe in some of the other movements?
So I think the Manischewitz Haggadah, the Maxwell, Haggadah, and Manischewitz also produced the Haggadah. Right. I didn't show it here, but it's in the larger one. Those Haggadot really have the idea I can be a Zionist and I can be Jewish. Some, like the Rabbi Golden's Haggadah, Hyman Golden, an important Orthodox rabbi, he's still a little nervous about the line Next Year in Jerusalem. Manischewitz's, they are deeply Zionist, are up front. Maxwell House, as we saw, was very upfront in terms of the painting and the Hebrew, but it still uses this antiquated English to get around the idea of Next Year in Jerusalem. Now, the phrase Next Year in Jerusalem is immensely important to DPs. Indeed, some of them said this year in Jerusalem. There was a famous Seder plate produced and then distributed to its chief donors by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee that says this year in Jerusalem. And, for those people, some of them refused to go anywhere but Israel. And of course, that becomes possible for them to leave the DP camps and move to the land of Israel in 1948. And I'll just add that quite a few artists from Europe make Haggadot in America. Again, you have to see the long version of this. And Next Year in Jerusalem is important to them. Yeah.
And we have time for two more questions that are going to go to David Goldstein and Sarah Brooks. And David, it's amazing. You seem to be prophetic, because your last sentence is always tying into the next question. And you just mentioned about Next Year in Jerusalem. David Goldstein asks about that phrase. Are we really praying for Mashiach to imminently come, or what are maybe some of the different perspectives that underscore what Next Year in Jerusalem?
Well, that's why we have so many pages of interpretation. Does it mean that we want God, to take us back? As I say, I think to the medievals who said "Lashon haba b'Yerushalayim" and would cry it out. That was a statement that it's nice here in Bavel, but or wherever, but we hope to be able to do it in the Beit HaMikdash. But clearly, And we saw that at the very first slide. For some people, it was a kind of Yerushalayim Shomala rather than Yerushalayim Shomata. Let's have a kind of heavenly Jerusalem that we pray for. And there have been, there is a long tradition of people who say, oh, Lashana Bob Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim has the word shalom in it, and that's what we're really praying for, is messianic times or peace times and so on. In other words, you attempt to explain the phrase in a way that will make it acceptable to visitors and non-Jews who read it. But there was always the fear that next year in Jerusalem means that you don't want to be next year in New York. And for people who thought Jews were disloyal, that was a proof text. And Jews were sensitive to that matter.
Sure. This final question from Sarah is, when did prayer for our country, quote unquote, enter the liturgy? Of course, we have a Pirkei Avot, Havei Mitpalel B'Shlama Shel Malchut, but the idea of seeing such a prayer, I'm not sure if that's been seen in the Haggadah, but I guess it has been in some Haggadot.
Right. I mean, the simple answer is, Sarah, if you write to me at sarna@brandeis.edu, I'll send you my article on the Jewish prayers for the United States government, the prayer that some Jews say, some synagogues, which begins uniquely. There's no prayer that starts Hanotein Shua Lamlachim, he who gives dominion to kings. And that is esoteric language. It's clear. Anyone who looks up the reference will see that the next line in the same psalm, which Jews knew but didn't say, is Petseni v'atzileni miyad b'nei nechar. Rescue me, save me from these Gentiles. And there was a very long tradition of not saying that prayer in a free country like America. First of all, we don't have kings. So really, until if you go to any 19th century prayer book, I mean Orthodox prayer book published in America, it has a different prayer. In a different article, I showed that prayer was probably written by Max Lilienthal, one time chief rabbi of New York, later a very famous Reform rabbi, ironically. But his prayer, which is a weird prayer in a lot of ways, because it depicts America as if it were Zion, let us have rain in due time, and so on, which works in the land of Israel, but not so much in New Jersey, New York. But anyway, but then East European Jews, being used to the prayer for the government, bring it back in their prayer books. There are a couple of prayer books that even bring it back with a name, but of course that's a bad idea because it rapidly dates as presidents change, and then they go back to the tradition of depersonalizing the prayer, a tradition that goes literally back to George Washington. You pray for the office, not the person. But it's not identical to the prayer as recited in Europe. If you look even at the Birnbaum prayer book, which has it, and compare word for word, you'll see that the idea that our enemies should be under our feet and so on is all removed as too militant in his. And of course, the conservative movement has a very significant alternative prayer, written by no less than Levi Ginsburg, which is also used in the Reconstructionist movement. And the Reform movement has an early prayer in the Union Prayer Book, which then disappears altogether. But take a look at my article there for more on that, or someday I'm glad to give another lecture on that subject. But I do encourage, there's not enough work on the history of these prayer books and particular prayers and carrying them through time and what can be learned from them.
Thank you so much to Professor Sarna for joining us and presenting fascinating history and wonderful visual presentation as well. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and to those who sponsored or made donations with registration. We hope to see you at future UTJ webinars. There is a link in the chat to provide feedback. We will send out a video of this program, and that will include that link as well. And we wish everyone a Chag Kasher v'Sameach, a happy and kosher Passover, and again, hope to see you in future UTJ programs. Thank you again.
All right. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.